人民真活国，中央人民政府今天胜利了。
The people have stood up, the Chinese Communist Revolution, in bringing China into a new frontier. On October 1st, 1949, at 3 o'clock p.m. in Tiananmen Square, Beijing, Chairman Mao Zedong proclaimed the creation of the People's Republic of China. The Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang had been fighting over who would govern China for over 20 years. Finally, the Communist Party had routed the nationalists, forcing remnants of the Kuomintang to flee to the island of Taiwan. Peace returned to China once more. The Chinese Communist Revolution from 1927 to 1949 brought China from a shattered, backwards nation, driven by weak and unpopular governance, into the frontier of the modern world by bringing the Communist Party to power. A popular and grassroots government had taken power and would steer China from being a weak nation to becoming the world's secondary superpower. The road to the successful Chinese Communist Revolution begins in the late 19th century, where the ineffectiveness and weakness of the ruling Qing dynasty set the scene for the future decades-long struggle for power in China. Plagued with vices such as rampant drug use, prostitution, and foreign imperialism, China was going through a period of time known as the Century of Humiliation, and was known as the Sick Man of Asia. Foreign powers held huge influence in China, carving China up into spheres of influence. In 1911, the Qing were deposed by the Xinhai Revolution. A new republic was founded, which would collapse a year later, causing China to fracture into many small warlord states. Any central authority remaining in China had evaporated, which only made China weaker and more vulnerable to foreign influence and imperialism. The average person's life in China also became worse, with banditry, thievery, and starvation commonplace. By the mid-1920s, two major forces in China were the warlord government based out of Beijing and the united front between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party based out of southern China. The Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921 by a group of urban intellectuals, birthed out of anti-Western and anti-imperialistic sentiment. The Chinese Nationalist Party, also known as the Kuomintang, was a nationalistic and authoritarian political party in China. Led by Chiang Kai-shek, the Kuomintang was much stronger than the CCP. In 1927, the United Front began the reclamation of northern China. During the invasion, Chiang ordered the Shanghai Massacre, killing thousands of CCP members and communist sympathizing workers. This act of betrayal to the alliance ended all cooperation between the CCP and the Kuomintang, beginning the Chinese Civil War. Communist ideology revolved around cities and factory workers, but the nationalists had the upper hand militarily, forcing the CCP to flee into the countryside. Mao Zedong, who would later rise to become leader of the CCP, believed that power ought to lie in the hands of the peasants and ordinary people of China. China was a mostly agrarian nation, with 80% of the roughly 500 million Chinese being the peasantry, with a vast majority of these peasants starving and living in abject poverty. City dwellers fared little better, with most illiterate and living in unhygienic conditions. By the end of 1928, the Kuomintang had reunified China. However, local warlords subservient to the Kuomintang remained in power in most of China, with these warlords being more concerned with personal gain than governing. In 1931, Japan snatched up Manchuria, facing little resistance. Chiang followed a policy of securing the interior before ridding China of foreign imperialism. In 1934, Chiang broke the communists' lines, forcing the CCP into a general retreat known as the Long March. The CCP lost all of their bases and almost 90% of their military to starvation and the nationalists, but had survived, escaping to the mountains. At their new base in Yan'an, the CCP, led by Mao Zedong, enacted land reform and educated peasants, presenting themselves as the party for the ordinary people. In 1936, the nationalists and the communists made peace and created another united front to fight the encroaching Japanese. On July 7, 1937, a small firefight at the Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing occurred between China and Japan, which later escalated into a full-scale Japanese invasion of China. The United Front fought for China's survival, but were pushed back further and further. Nationalist forces bore the brunt of the fighting, facing the Japanese war machine head-on, with China tying down millions of Japanese troops during World War II. On August 15, 1945, after the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Japan by the United States, Japan surrendered. Like elsewhere around the world, the Chinese people were celebrating victory in the Second World War and were hoping for a continuation of peace and prosperity. Unfortunately for China, peace would not last long, and another war was starting up again, despite the nation being exhausted from the last. During World War II, Japan had ravaged China, committing mass atrocities and razing cities, causing people to have nothing but grass to eat while the dead lay strewn everywhere. America attempted to bring peace to the conflict by sending George C. Marshall in 1945 to negotiate the creation of a pro-American coalition government between the CCP and the Kuomintang, but these negotiations went nowhere, with Marshall leaving China in 1947. Under the leadership of Mao, the Communists had grown significantly larger throughout the Second Sino-Japanese War, with them now controlling 1/4 of China's area and having over 3.2 million men in their armed forces. In post-war China, inflation, unemployment, and poverty were all skyrocketing, with industrial output at an all-time low. Economic freefall, combined with years of government cruelty and corruption, led to most people losing faith in the nationalist government. Ordinary people, and later, military officers, became vulnerable to communism. Mao and the Communists, on the other hand, were a grassroots organization with popular support. Communist leaders and officials lived just like and close to ordinary people. People trusted the Communists and held faith in their ideals. The Communists enacted policies extremely favorable to peasants, continuing their education campaigns and land reform. Land reform redistributed land from landlords forcibly, taking millions out of poverty and bringing farmers to the frontier of owning the land they tilled on. The CCP land reform was very popular amongst peasants, which single-handedly drew millions of them into the People's Liberation Army, giving the CCP an almost infinite amount of manpower to call upon during the Civil War. On July 20th, 1946, ceasefire between the two sides was broken when Chiang launched a massive invasion of northern China, restarting full-scale conflict. Initially, the CCP fought a guerrilla war to survive against larger and superior nationalist forces until 1947, when the nationalist advance was halted. In 1948, the three campaigns of the Chinese Civil War began, with the Communists on the offensive. In September, the Liaoshen campaign secured communist control of the northeast. In November, the Huaihai and Pingjing campaigns reached the Yangtze River and captured Beijing respectively. After the fall of Beijing, the Communist 4th Field Army marched down Dongjiao Mingshang Lane, location of the Beijing Legation Quarter, where decades ago, Chinese people weren't allowed in their own lands. As the 4th Field Army marched down the lane, they were met with cheers from onlookers, being a symbolic end to the century of humiliation in China. When the Communists reached the Yangtze, Stalin told Mao to stop and negotiate with Chiang to create a coalition government, with Stalin's intention being to create a weak and allied China that he could exploit. Mao refused, and in April of 1949, Communist forces crossed the Yangtze River before quickly capturing the nationalist capital of Nanjing. In October, Mao proclaimed the creation of the People's Republic of China. After that, the Communists were able to rush south facing little resistance. The nationalist government retreated from Nanjing inwards into China, before ultimately leaving for Taipei in December of 1949. In May of 1951, Tibet was peacefully annexed into China, with all of mainland China being reunified by the PRC. Internationally, there were many impacts following the successful Chinese Communist Revolution. America viewed similar events happening all over East Asia, which gave birth to domino theory and American intervention in East Asian conflicts. Kim Il-sung, leader of the Communist North Korea, was emboldened by the success of Mao and attempted to mirror his successes by invading South Korea and beginning the Korean War. When American intervention almost destroyed the North, China reasserted itself by directly intervening on behalf of the North, challenging the world's strongest nation, which led to the stalemate in Korea today. Domestically, the communist victory brought forth a frenzy of revolutionary activities, attacking the bourgeoisie of China. Land reform was continued and furthered, while large businesses were seized or forcibly joint-owned by the government. In many other cases, however, the rich were executed in show trials. Revolutionary activity gave ordinary people socio-economic mobility. The communists also created hundreds of new schools, reducing illiteracy rates drastically. The creation of the People's Republic also brought Chinese women to the frontier of gender equality. Earlier, women did not go to school or work, and it was generally believed that women would just marry then raise kids. The CCP passed a variety of laws bringing greater gender equality, such as the marriage law, bringing women marriage rights, and the land law, bringing women into the workforce, with the slogan, "Women hold up half the sky," adopted by the party. Today, China is a nation with over 1 billion people and has been an economic powerhouse for years. China has come a long way from being the sick man of Asia under an ancient imperial dynasty to becoming a global superpower under a communist regime. Today, China plays a key role in global production chains, with China producing over 20% of the world's goods. China in the world would be a very different place today had the revolution failed, whether for better or for worse.